Hello and welcome back to Session 3. The language of special in the culture of education. Don't call me special. Disabled people do not like the word special. Our needs are not special, they are the human needs we all have according to the United Nations, but rights often denied. What is special? If anything, it could be seen as the way we get our needs met. The big parking spaces, ramps, automatic doors, accessible toilets, straws, lifts, level classrooms, differentiated materials, etc. These level the field in an otherwise discriminatory and inequitable world. Speaking with authority. Professional wisdom is a beautiful thing, especially when applied to teaching practice and school relationships. As research suggests, the difference between political correctness and respectful language is not whether a word is right or wrong, but whether the meaning strengthens or counters a narrative that exists in storytelling. The critique here is that special often strengthens an ableist narrative, particularly when used to mean labeled, but less so if it is used to mean disadvantaged by discrimination and inequality. While many labeled learners enjoy their lives at school, it is most probable that most, or their families, have struggled to have their rights to education upheld to begin with. See Session 1. Language reveals a lot about school culture, and equally it is educational storytelling that tells us about what matters to us as professionals. It would be wrong to think of educational space as free of prejudice, disadvantage and inequality. Because few schools speak from a position that acknowledges what is said by the marginalized groups within them and in society more widely. Where disability is never spoken of, it's far more likely that discrimination will flourish, as it isn't disrupted. The result of this silence is lack of parity on a great scale, because the number of those facing its negative impact is large. Many of us underestimate the scale of inequality imposed by education and therefore the cost to the institution as a whole. Therefore, divergent voices are required to address the stories told that are presently distorted by conjecture, myths and assumptions. The authors of disabled people's interests are the voices that need acknowledging as contributors to knowledge. Implications for education. At school level, the issue is greater than a lack of fit, since labelled learners have no less readiness, curiosity and enthusiasm than their non-labelled peers. While all types of impairment, condition and difference have been successfully accommodated somewhere, it still seems barriers are substantial for far too many. Overall, better practice is patchy. Those labelled still face far greater barriers than most professionals imagine. For school leaders, the challenge is therefore to view a change in culture as a benefit to both to those affected by discrimination and the wider inequality imposed on the wider school community. Positive action, therefore, needs to address both discrimination and inequality strategically. It is not up to disabled teachers, or those labelled SEN, to be more fluent about their experience. Forests of documents on this topic already exist. The onus is on us, as teachers, scholars, and leadership teams to articulate more clearly the injustice imposed whole school populations. At the heart of ethical responsibility is in an imperative to take equality seriously as a route to safer environments, learning spaces. Furthermore, the distinctive nature of the disadvantage labelled learners face is an indirect cost to society. Therefore, more equitable participation is both an investment in their well-being and a far cheaper option for communities over time. This responsibility requires understanding of evidence at senior management, leadership teams and trustee levels. In order to avoid the time-consuming and costly tweaks at operational level that rarely alter culture or educational purpose. Strategic action at different levels. Individual, small changes need to be put in place to remove, minimize, and reduce the impact of the barriers and prejudice imposed on learners irrespective of a label. Organizational, having established a conversation about the barriers, articulating the language and culture faced by some learners, greater confidence will be available to address systemic issues and name outside influence. Institutional, educate the sector with the intent of taking knowledge from the school to beyond. Practice, purpose and vision may need to change. Direction, from a responsible and ethical perspective, means moving towards anti-ableist intent as a way of leveling the field, addressing inequality and aligning to the Sustainable Development Goals. adopting an allied position. An allied response demands action that needs to prioritize the interests of those labeled as they are most disadvantaged before extending to those who benefit from able privilege. Just any effort isn't sufficient. Practice needs to be with the right effort and have a deliberate direction. While good, best and proactive practice sometimes equate, operational can be strategic, but rarely unintentionally. Because being better at treating learners unfairly will not achieve more equitable outcomes. Practice might need to change to avoid the very activity that compounds the structural inequality experienced by so many. Addressing discrimination and inequality simultaneously is like tapping your head while rubbing your tummy. Different actions are required at class, school and educational levels. Disability studies. Seeking and responding to lived experience is essential yet an unsatisfactory minimum, as it only addresses the prejudice and barriers at individual level. Furthermore, we can't ask every labeled learner in turn what they understand by discrimination, without imposing on their time and generosity. We have to trust the voices of those who have also gained research evidence and professional wisdom on these matters. Disability studies give us frame, a language, like torchlight in the darkness, that highlights a specific sensitivity to ableism. As feminism gives us a sensitivity to the male gaze. Through its theoretical lens, it helps us question the ableism in ideology by highlighting misrepresentation in discourse. For example, Oliver refers to alternative ways of questioning experience. The medical model as asking the question, "What is wrong with you?" And the social model as asking the question, "What is wrong with society?" Critical disability studies. Critical theory is fundamentally about reflection for action, not a denial of existing ideas about education, but the addition of a recognizable voice to emerging discussion. In the same way feminism doesn't deny women's experience, but seeks to frame it as a personal experience, within institutional disadvantage and a global consciousness hidden beyond the orthodox nature of the male gaze. Without a definition, there is no feminist or critical race, gender, class theory. Similarly, an anti-ableist sensitivity is essential to the ethical practitioner wishing to deploy their skills in strategic ways to disrupt, interrupt, or counter ableism in culture. Lack of accountability. The medical model, also known as the individual or deficit model of disability, focuses on the person's difficulties and how these may be remediated or compensated for. Notice how society talks at disabled people. Responsibility. The social model, also referred to as an inclusive model of disability, focuses on the difficulties presented by society hindering the full participation of labeled learners. Accountability is the naming of an individualized and medicalized assumption about labeled learners. As a tool, or a theory, the medical model articulates the assumptions that labeled learners need to overcome deficit or be sent to remedial intervention to become school-ready. This is impossible for most, as would impose expensive treatment to make a normal learner, because normal does not exist. This is a nuanced articulation of the school environment, with personal access, needs, and difference being acknowledged within and not simply the all that often sees personal experience ignored to the point of denying effort or pain. Society listens to disabled people. Social model and lived experience. The social model proposes storytelling in which the disabled population are viewed as being disabled by institutional and societal culture. Naming this ableism frames the problem as one of language, practice and procedures that disadvantage the learner. Identifying ableism helps us think about how educational spaces need to change to offer a safe, fair, and equitable experience rather than the prejudice, discrimination and inequality that exists today. The legitimacy gap. The medical model, in disability studies, is a shorthand for lack of accountability in the response to disabled people as a population. Think back to ethical crises in session 1. The legitimacy gap refers to the amount education storytelling differs from the interests of the disabled population by being replaced by misrepresentation. Schools who acknowledge the significance of voice and theory will more ably respond in personal, internal and external exchanges by articulating clearly barriers, discrimination and injustice. For many, critical disability studies helps achieve legitimacy in practice by closing a gap in mainstream beliefs ideology, by adding disabled people's interests to ethical considerations in leadership conversation. Practice and knowledge. Making the research educational storytelling accountable to disabled people as a group is not the responsibility of a single researcher, one policy or a separate department. The idea that disability has a standalone file conflicts with the idea that everyone should be able to respond willingly and effectively to address discrimination. The task is to call out environments that impose disadvantage. The responsibility is shared. Accountability has two essential aspects, namely doing the right thing, performance, and giving an account of it, reporting. Professionals who can articulate the medical model's significance will respond with more legitimacy in conversation by framing systemic issues as barriers, inequality and injustice. Accountability and responsibility. Where accountability is sought as the ability to respond to those labelled as citizens included in civil rights movement, thus accounting for all those who have a right to the story that is told, as authors not bystanders. Responsibility can then be understood as an ongoing conversation to secure well-being outcomes, uphold human rights, and empower the members of organizations and the constituency they serve. Storytelling. Ableism. Ableism, a specific type of oppression, akin to homophobia, racism, classism, ageism, and sexism, held in the culture and language that inform society's debates. Anti-ableist, a defined position against ableism, a characteristic oppression that disabled people face, as in feminist or anti-racist. Theorizing, for example, with an anti-ableist legitimacy involves explicit reference to disabled people as tellers in a storytelling that holds their interests at their heart. Disabled storytellers and alternative storytelling. This talk provides ideas that will help you to think with increasing confidence about the individual, labeled learner, their skills, experience and knowledge. Discrimination, the barriers, negative attitudes and working practices faced by those labeled but not by their peers within organizations, sectors or professions, for example fear, lack of awareness, avoidance, microaggression, stares, complex or incomplete policies. Ableism, the misrepresentation or silencing in the documents, communications and wider storytelling of organizations. Impairment, condition, difference or functioning, private information, the disclosure of which is an individual's choice. The same is true for their identity as a disabled person. Inclusive practice and ongoing process of adjusting equitably to diversity. It is all very good news for addressing the prejudice, discrimination and inequality.